Hi, welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and I have with me today a true trailblazer in the world of sports reporting. Back in 1977, women were not allowed to go into locker rooms, and Melissa Ludtke is the first female sports reporter for Sports Illustrated. And that was a position she held in 1977. And when she tried to cover the 1977 World Series, Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn banned her from the locker rooms. So she has now written a book. It's the 50th, it's almost the 50th anniversary of that event.
Just
The new
about.
book, yes, and the new book is called Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside. Melissa, welcome to Lights Camera Author.
Well, welcome. It's a wonderful name for a show. I'm not quite sure how I got on it, but it's a terrific name. So I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you.
Well, we have the lights, we have the camera, and you're the author. So that,
Okay, fabulous.
but you became the very first female sports reporter for Sports Illustrated. Back in, now was it 1975 when it
Well, I'm going to have to correct you here because there were actually a lot of women who were what Sports Illustrated called reporter researchers. That was the fancy name they gave us. The actual way that we were usually referred to within the Time Inc. system were as fact checkers. We were the ones who usually were on the receiving end of the stories that mostly the men wrote, and it was our job to be sure that they didn't have any factual errors. Of course, we always found factual errors, so it was a rather typical assignment for women to clean up after the men. And that was really our job. It was only during the early 1970s when women like me were coming out of school with a very different message about the possibilities and opportunities that we ought to be seeking. Many of my classmates went to graduate schools in business and law, becoming some of the first women to do that. So when I came to Sports Illustrated, I held that job and was brought into it as an entry-level job as a reporter researcher. As I say, there were a lot of women in that designated job. But from my perspective, unlike those who had come to it before, I knew that to earn my paycheck, I had to fact check stories. But I also saw opportunities in having that job to try to become a writer, to do a lot of reporting on the side so I could make myself useful to writers as someone who could go out in the field and do the work. So it was really brought on by a new generation, of which I was one, coming into a world and where a previous generation saw only barriers, we saw opportunities and took them. So it's a designation issue. You're generally right that I was among the first women who took advantage of these opportunities we had in the 70s, as a lot of discrimination policies were being overturned in the courts. Heck, up until then, you couldn't get a credit card without your husband's, signature on it. And you couldn't do a lot of things. So we were right on the cusp of those changes. And so I was, willing to put in the extra hours. So during the day, I would fact check stories, but at night, because I had the designation as a reporter at Sports Illustrated, I would be up at either Yankee Stadium or Shea Stadium because I worked in New York, and I would be learning all about the game and how to report the game, and eventually writing some stories and doing a lot of reporting. So that gives you, I think, a background to kind of the context of the time and sort of how I fit into it.
And also further the background. Now, of course, we're going to talk about the 1977 case with the World Series and Commissioner Bowie
Sure.
Kuhn, all that. But I'd like to make people aware that the 1977 World Series was not your first. Was it? Yes, it was your it was a big event of the year, the 77 World Series. But you actually covered the Yankees. You were able to go into their locker room with no issues throughout what was the last 2 weeks of the season?
Yeah, I wouldn't say without any issues, but
Okay.
yes, I had put in a lot of time around the Yankees over the two seasons, the 76 season and 77 season. And I had quietly, not making demands, not trying to burst through doors that I knew were sort of locked on me. I had worked very closely with the PR person for the New York Yankees, a young man named Mickey Morabito. In his rookie season, my same age, which is critical because he understood the changing times that we were all part of, with the women's movement sort of happening outside of the fortress of baseball. So Mickey came to me midway through the season, and I think this is what you're referring to, and offered me the following opportunity. He said, I'll come into the locker room, meet you at the side door to the clubhouse, open that from the inside, and then I will escort you into Billy Martin, who was the manager's office after the game. So, being the gradualist that I had to be, I mean, when you're the only woman, you aren't someone who can think you can make a demand and it's going to happen. So I said, thank you very much, Mickey. And that was great. So that was the first entry that I had into the clubhouse. I still wasn't in the part of the clubhouse, which is the locker room where the players were. So your number two is correct, but it was the last two games, not the last 2 weeks. Last two games, I came up to the stadium and I found Mickey had left me fresh press passes that gave me full access to the clubhouse. When I saw him on the field before the game, I said, Mickey, did you mean to leave these for me? I mean, I was rather surprised. And he said, Melissa, he said, you've earned every bit of it. He said, you've been in the manager's office. You've never tried to walk through the manager's office into the locker room. You have shown that you've, kind of earned this. It was, in some ways it was very complimentary. Others, it was sort of a little bit, you've sort of earned this good girl award.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you a little bit more. And so he went to the guards and said, she'll have access just like the men. So you're right. The last two games of the season, I did have full clubhouse access. I worked alongside the men, but here's the difference. He was right. I used my judgment, and on the first of both those games, I only used the pass in the 45 minutes between batting practice and the game. And that was a time when no player was changing out of his uniform. He'd come from the field in batting practice, he stayed in his uniform, and he was going to go back on the field. Why I had ever been banned from being in the locker room at that time is a mystery that will never be unsolved because Bowie Kuhn is no longer with us. But I had been banned, even though there was not one player who was naked even from the waist up during that time. So I used the press passes then, and then during the American League Championship Series, I was in the locker room. And at that point, you're again right that there was no one who wrote a story about it. So it didn't seem to be so disruptive that someone would note it. I wasn't thrown out. And although not every player certainly was on board with me being there, it all worked. It was fine. So we're coming to the World Series, and I'm thinking, yes, the Yankees are okay with this. So that's kind of where we are.
Now, what was Billy Martin like when he first saw you?
Billy was fine. Mickey and Billy were very, very close. And Billy and Mickey were so close that when Billy finally got fired for the last time from the Yankees, Mickey went out with him to the Oakland A's. So I knew that Mickey had talked about this with him. I knew he'd prepared him. As well, any good PR person should prepare a manager and a team for something that is a change in the culture of the game. Mickey was great with me. He would sit back in his seat with his desk in his office. I would sit on the small little couch in front of him. The men would come in and out from the locker room having interviewed the players. And most of the time I was looking at the soles of his cowboy boots because he would put his feet up, on the desk, and I would kind of be looking through those. Sometimes he'd take his baseball shirt off. He'd be sitting there in sort of his undershirt. And he was fine. He never said a word about me being there. He had no problem with it. However, and this is where it's a very good question to ask. However, when it came time for the court case to happen, and baseball filed various affidavits against me having access. At that point, there's an affidavit that is supposedly written by Billy Martin, but it was written by, the commissioner's lawyers, and he was forced to sign it, saying that he would never want me to be in his office. I understood. I mean, everyone who was in baseball had to adhere to what the commissioner said. He had ultimate authority. And there were other affidavits that I could see were written by the commissioner's lawyers. Billy wasn't alone.
And going into the 77 World Series, you got with the Dodgers representative, Tommy John, the pitcher, and they took a vote. And yes, it wasn't unanimous, but they go with majority, as you say in your book, that yeah, fine, that you can come in. They didn't have a problem with it.
Okay. Let me pick up with that story a little. I mean, I came down on Monday afternoon to the workout game before the World Series, and in my mind was paying a courtesy call to the Dodgers. I actually knew Tommy Lasorda very well from an assignment I'd done at the end of the season before I'd gone out on a reporting assignment. He knew me very well. And so the first person I went to was Tommy Lasorda. And because, again, I was a gradualist and not someone who was ready to sort of throw my body into the barricades. My proposition, if you can call it that, to Tommy Lasorda when I first talked with him was simply to have access to him. I thought that would be a good first step during the World Series for a team that had never had a woman covering it. Tommy Lasorda wanted nothing to do with me, with this conversation. He handed me off like I was a hot potato to Tommy John, who was the player rep. Tommy John, pitcher Tommy John, yes, of the famous Tommy John elbow surgery. First time we'd ever met, we walked out and sat in the Dodgers dugout, talked for maybe 10, 15 minutes. He looked at my pass. I told him a little bit about the history of my work with the Yankees. I told him how I'd gone to Lasorda because of trying to sort of replicate going to Martin first and then to the team. Tommy listened very well. And at the end of it, he said to me something he still says to me to this day and has said on various radio and TV programs. He said, he says, I as a player would feel very uncomfortable with this. He said, but I do understand that as you have the right to be there. And so that's what I'm going to go back and talk with my team about. So I really, really respected him for sharing that nuanced view of how he'd feel personally versus how he felt I had the right to be there. And eventually, of course, it was the judgment of the court that I also had the right to have the same access as the men did. The court could not tell baseball to let us into the locker room. That wasn't their job. They can't tell a company how to run their company and run their policy. All the court could rule on, and what they did rule on, is that whatever policy you set up for the men, the women must have that same policy at the same time. So Tommy John really was the one who, brought this to the team, came back to me right before the first game, said, as you said, it wasn't unanimous, but it was a majority. Off we go. And please tell our PR people that we've had this conversation. Again, I didn't have to do that, but as a courtesy, I went and found their PR person. And that's how the commissioner found out. It wasn't that the Yankees told them. It was because of what I'd gone to have these conversations with the Dodgers. So it was the Dodgers conversation that led us into the edict, and that eventually led us into the courtroom.
And back in that era, now, as you mentioned in your book, in 1921, in the wake of the Chicago Black Sox scandal, the owners got together and appointed a commissioner of baseball, and the commissioner had dictatorial powers. Anything he said, that was it. He was kind of like the Pope of baseball. And unfortunately, I mean, it sounds like what you went through is a lot like what African American ball players went through when they tried to break into the major leagues. Was that no, we don't, commissioner says no, we're not going to let them in. Bowie Kuhn said, no, I'm not going to let her in for as long as I'm commissioner, he said. And he was only
That's
50
right.
years old.
And he was young.
Yes.
Yeah.
And really there was no reasoning for it except that's his personal opinion.
Well, you're absolutely right. What we found out in the course of the discovery that we did of all of the internal memos and documents that we were able to get from baseball, as they were able to get internal documents from time. That's just how it works when you've gotten your case into a courtroom situation. We were able to find out that there was no evidence whatsoever that Bowie Kuhn or anyone representing him had ever spoken to one player about how they felt about this policy. It came down very much from on top, as you said. The clause in the best interests of baseball ultimately gave Commissioner Kuhn, just like it had given the first commissioner in 1921 and all that followed, the authority to make decisions that he alone justified as being in the best interests of baseball, and the owners were meant to go along with him, hook, line, and sinker. No debate within baseball. It was a dictatorial situation. Interestingly, just prior to 1977, and in fact into the courts in 1977, had been the Charlie Finley case, in which the owner of the Oakland A's did take the commissioner to court. Now he lost, and he lost in large part because of that clause in the best interests of baseball that the court said gave Kuhn, the dictatorial powers to say that Finley could not basically have a garage sale for his best players. And so prior to my case, immediately prior to it, was the case filed by Curt Flood, the outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, where he was trying to challenge baseball and the commissioner on what eventually became the free agency system. So you had Curt Flood, who also lost to Bowie Kuhn, again, due to the antitrust exemption of baseball, as well as that best interest clause in the commissioner. What I think Kuhn failed to realize, it seems so obvious, but I think he was just blown away by his sense of power, his sense of hubris, his sense that he'd won in court every time until we reached my case. But the difference was that I didn't work for him. I wasn't part of baseball. He could not rule necessarily against me as he could against a player or an owner in terms of that best interest clause. Believe me, they tried in court. As you've read the book, you'll see that they bring that up, and the judge is fairly quick to dismiss that as irrelevant to this case.
And not only did they bring it up in court, they mounted a public relations campaign against you.
Well, they did, and it was a very effective one. Very
yeah,
effective. There is
I can,
absolutely no doubt whatsoever that I lost in the court of public opinion. And I
I,
lost the court of public opinion because baseball and the sports writers, most every one of them, combined to make the ball players the victim of my invasion into their area, and and incorporated the sexual overtones as though I was there both as a sexual object of their attention, but also as somewhat of this vixen who was somehow going to be there in order to maybe go out on dates with players or something. But they made it that way. You're right. You've looked at some of the headlines, some of the stories that I cite in this. It was a very moralistic argument, and it was made to make me appear to be an immoral woman. And once you are painted as being an immoral woman, as we see even today, you've lost. You've lost in the court of public opinion. As much as you may have the law on your side, and we did, the success in painting me as that kind of a person certainly succeeded.
And what got me was that the issue was raised by, well, it was like on the NBC network had the game of the week on Saturdays. And Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek, I remember them being the play-by-play person
Sure.
and color analyst.
Yep.
And I remember Joe Garagiola specifically saying that any woman who wants to come into a men's locker room, what was it that he said? He's like either a pervert or a voyeur.
Well, that
Which,
was pretty much the words. They may not have used exactly those, but certainly words that were synonyms were usually put around me and my case. There was no question about it. Joe Garagiola was picking up the sort of thread of the day. Red Smith, who clearly at that point was the dean of sports journalism, he'd won the Pulitzer Prize the year before in 1976. He wrote a column right out of the box that ran on January 9th in the New York Times, but it was syndicated throughout the US papers, thousands of papers. People today don't understand the power of that syndicated column. It was like an internet then. It just went out everywhere.
yeah.
And Red Smith's column was replayed in papers from the US and Canada, everywhere. And so his column about me set the tone. And in his column, he basically referred to me as a piece of fluff. He called my case sort of a laughable matter at the end of an otherwise sort of serious sports season filled with real issues as opposed to this joke of an issue. Fortunately for me, at that time, the New York Times sports department was being run by the only woman who's ever run it, Leanne Schreiber. And Leanne Schreiber did something that no other editor had ever done to anything that Red Smith wrote for the New York Times. She edited him. When she caught wind of the column, which she caught late after it had gone out on the wire to the syndicators, she caught it before it went in the paper or when it was going in, and she crossed out the whole final paragraph. So if you go back in newspapers.com today and you look at the version in the New York Times and the version that ran in every other paper, you will see that the last paragraph is about me wanting to go in so that I can see Reggie Jackson bare or naked. And Leanne took that paragraph out. It ends differently in the New York Times. And Leanne put a headline on it that actually had the word equality in it, which was very rare. And I've gone back and done a pretty thorough look, which I talk about in my book, of the headlines that were put on it by editors at the papers that received the syndicated column. Equality was not in the headline. It was often puns that had to do with sex and baseball and some combination of the two. So that's a very kind of flagrant and very challenging moment for me when Red Smith made that declaration, because as we know, one journalist who's respected by all others can set the narrative frame through which a story will be retold and retold and retold. And that January 9th piece by Red Smith did exactly that.
And for those of you who think that it is less misogynistic nowadays, I think you only have to look at what's going on in the political world right now, because you mentioned in your book, I mean, there are women's rights have been taken away recently by the Supreme Court in one specific item. Not to get political, but this is what happens: is that the Dawes decision took away a woman's right for reproductive choices, and we have a woman now running for president of the United States. So, I mean, yes, there is it less misogynistic now?
People ask me that question a lot. It's a good question. I like you asking it to me because it gives me a time to be able to reflect back on a time in our media ecosystem that a lot of people don't know because they weren't part of it. They've only grown up in the digital world and the online world of social media. Back then, the men held the microphones and they held the typewriters. But the civilizing effect was that oftentimes they had to have their byline, their name, and they often had their picture at the top of a column. So
Mhm.
that tended to be, as I said, a civilizing civility. There was more civility. Now, it didn't feel like civility to me because the person they were writing about I didn't recognize. There was a level of misogyny back then. We didn't have the word misogyny, we didn't know it. Just like we didn't have the phrase sexual harassment or sexual abuse. We didn't know that those things existed, or we certainly didn't have a name for it. That would really take the Anita Hill hearings of 1991, which were still, 13 years in the future. So there was an awful lot going on that was, yes, misogynistic and certainly demeaning and degrading to me and to my cause, which was simply to be able to do my job like the men did theirs. I mean, I found nothing sexy about it. I found nothing really challenging about it. I was simply asking for the same opportunities they had to do this job that I had been assigned because the editors of Sports Illustrated felt that I had the competency and the skills and the judgment to be able to do it. So, it was an odd time. So young people ask me today, well, what was it like compared to now? And, they think, oh my God, must have been much worse for you, back then being the only one, etc. And then I remind them about the bylines and the pictures and that civility that had to kind of be part of that. And I remind them of the anonymity now, which has taken us into the sewer. And where women get death threats, women get sexually objectified, women are degraded simply for offering an opinion about sports. So I don't know. You got to have a tough skin for this still today. I had to have one. Mine didn't turn out to be quite tough enough because a lot seeped through. And as you've read in my book, I made some really bad personal decisions in my life because I was sort of looking for a safe harbor, someplace I could just kind of get away from it and try to, get reinforced. Um, but yes, there are a lot of things. And I think the last thing I'll say to this point is that I rewrote the prologue to my book after I'd kind of finally finished with a number of revisions and edits. And by then, the Dobbs decision had been passed. And it was actually only then that I realized that my daughter at that time, when I was rewriting that prologue, was 26 years old. She was 26 and I was 26 when this lawsuit happened. So here we are, each of us 26, each of us living through a time that's going to be remembered for how women responded to the barriers that, the legal system put in their way. And so I really felt a connection to my daughter, but also to this generation that really is going to have to refight some of these battles for our rights that my generation fought almost 50 years ago.
Well, the book is called Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside. The author is Melissa Ludtke. Melissa, I really want to thank you for coming on Lights Camera Author today.
Well, you have just honored me by inviting me on as a guest, and I'm never going to forget the title of it. And thank you. I hope your listeners, enjoy the storytelling I've been able to offer them, a look back, but also an understanding of how that look back informs us about what's happening today. So thanks for the opportunity.